Good evening and welcome to the National Press Club. It's great to look out in the audience and see a lot of friends, many friends. So I know we're going to have a great discussion this evening. I'm Barbara Cochran. I'm a professor for the Missouri School of Journalism and also president of the National Press Club Journalism Institute. Tonight's event is sponsored by the Journalism Institute, which produces many of the educational programs here at the Press Club, and I'm very excited about hearing this discussion. I began my career in journalism 4 decades ago, and at that time women, when they were seen in newspapers at all, were seen in what were called the society pages. Women were covered as homemakers, mothers, and hostesses. And if a woman appeared in the news section, she was usually described by her hair color or her marital status. The idea of women as newsmakers or experts or even as citizens with an opinion on an important issue of the day, forget about it. We've made some progress over the years, as we'll hear tonight, in how often women are quoted or sought out for their knowledge or expertise. But you'll also hear some information that will show we still have a long way to go. And to discuss the issue, we have a fabulous group of leading news executives and commentators. I'm going to start to my immediate left and introduce first Ken Strickland. Ken is the bureau chief of NBC News. He joined NBC in 1995 and rose through the ranks as a producer with some of the most important assignments at the network and deputy Washington bureau chief. Next, we have Anna Palmer. Anna is senior Washington correspondent for Politico and co-author of Politico Influence, which is the daily newspaper about the nexus of politics, lobbying, and money. Not much to cover there, right? Next to Anna is Jill Zuckman. Jill became a managing director at SKDKnickerbocker 2 years ago after serving as director of public affairs for Transportation Secretary Ray LaHood. Before that, Jill had a 20-year career as a journalist, covering national politics for the Boston Globe and later the Chicago Tribune. Next to Jill is our moderator. And she's also the mastermind of tonight's event, along with Amy Weiss, Linda Kramer Jenning. Linda is the Washington editor of Glamour magazine and an adjunct professor in the Georgetown University graduate program in journalism. Next to Linda is, let me look at my cheat sheet here. There's Ruth. That's Ruth Marcus. Ruth is a columnist and editorial writer for the Washington Post, specializing in politics and domestic policy. Before joining the Post editorial board 10 years ago, she covered the Supreme Court and the White House, among other beats, and served as deputy national editor. And next to Ruth is Matt Winkler. Matt is editor-in-chief of Bloomberg News, which he co-founded with Michael Bloomberg in 1990. Matt has earned many awards and honors for his journalism and is an active member of a number of journalism groups, but I want to single out the International Women's Media Foundation, where he and I both are very pleased to serve on the board. And finally, our last panelist to introduce is Sally Buzbee. Sally is the Washington bureau chief for the Associated Press and oversees more than 100 reporters and editors here in Washington. She was AP's Middle East editor based in Cairo for 5 years, leading coverage of the Iraq War, Iran, and terrorist cells. And she returned to the U.S. in 2009 as deputy managing editor based in New York. And now, before I turn things over to Linda, I want to show a video greeting from the National Press Club's president, Angela Greiling-Keene. Angela was so disappointed not to be here tonight, not least because her big boss is on the panel, but also because this subject is one of great interest to her, and his interest in women in journalism has been one of the hallmarks of her presidency of the Press Club. But as you will hear in this video that we have of her, duty called her away. And so now let's roll the tape and hear from Angela.
Welcome to the National Press Club. I'm Angela Greiling-Keene, a reporter for Bloomberg News and the president of the National Press Club. I'm also a board member of the nonprofit affiliate, the National Press Club Journalism Institute, the sponsor of tonight's event. I'm honored to welcome our distinguished panelists and our audience here tonight. I wish I could be there in person, but I'm in Detroit covering the auto show as part of my beat. Finding ways we can increase the number of women news sources on all beats, including business, is a topic I think is critically important, and I'm thrilled all of you are here tonight to talk about it. I am pleased to turn the program back to moderator Linda Kramer Jenning.
Glad that she's out reporting, although we wish she could be with us this evening to talk about this issue we all find so interesting. Because, as they say, women may hold up half the sky, but they certainly don't hold up even half of the daily global news report. Women are underrepresented in the subjects of news stories, the sources, and among the reporters and editors who are responsible for those reports. So one of the first questions we want to address today is why that matters. Why is it important? And I'm going to ask each panelist to share some of their thoughts on that, with our goal of all of us being committed to producing better journalism. And so we're going to start with Sally.
Why do I think it matters? Essentially, we all know that subjects and ways of looking at subjects are going to be overlooked or just completely we're clueless about them unless we have a diverse group of people in our newsrooms who can ask questions, who can reach out to people. And if we are talking to people about issues, the sources that we talk to, that same thing is going to happen. You can debate about an issue, and if you're only hearing from certain same voices, you're not going to get the full range of opinions. People are going to be surprised. Later on when that happens. We're going to talk a lot tonight about news in the United States, but I remember just very vividly during the Iraq War the challenges of talking to Iraqi women and how incredibly one-sided that made much of our coverage, because it's very difficult to understand what the impacts of anything like a conflict are on a country unless you can understand how that's affecting half of the country. So, it's exactly, to me, the same issue in terms of we're not going to be able to understand how any different groups of people in this country or anywhere respond to things unless we are actually talking to them. I think that's the bottom line answer.
Thank you. And Matt?
I think the biggest possible picture is something that I hope everybody in this room appreciates, because the data is unambiguous and it comes directly from the IMF, among others, and that is wherever poverty is greatest, the gender gap is widest. And so that's not just an issue for journalists, that's an issue for everybody, assuming everybody is committed to reducing poverty, which has an economic imperative. And the second part of this is the economics itself. The developed world faces a demographic challenge in that it is not increasing its population as it needs to be productive going forward. There's plenty of evidence now that shows where women have the greatest freedom to work, they also have the greatest freedom to create families. They actually go together. They're not mutually exclusive. So if you look at this on one hand purely as an economic issue, there is a great incentive, and not just among journalists, to do everything we can to narrow the gender gap.
So are we trying to address the question of why it matters that women are quoted, or why it matters that women are reporters and editors? Just
you get to
because I think they're
slice.
different. Because I think they're different questions.
Well, move to the one that most intrigues you.
So I think that because I think they matter. I think they both matter, but they matter for different reasons. I think the question of whether women are quoted as sources in news stories matters less to, I might get myself in a little bit of trouble with Matt here, but I think it matters less to the quality of most of those news stories. Certainly, Sally, your example of quoting Iraqi women, there is no ability to cover a society if you can only speak to half of that society. But if you can only speak to men on Wall Street, you may be missing some really good stories, okay? But that's going to get to the other half of the equation. But you're not, if you're only going to talk to male analysts about what they think the Fed is going to do on QE2, you're not hurting your readers in terms of the news file. I do think you are hurting the impact of that is not good on society, because you're just sending a message not necessarily consciously. I find myself sometimes when on panels and people are asking questions, you realize you're calling on men and you just kind of hit yourself in the head. And I've been at college audiences where only men have asked questions, and I've refused to take any more questions until a woman asks a question, and we'll see what happens here. But I think in terms of the sources, it's a sort of societal issue that being quoted brings you prominence, it brings you a sense of notoriety, it suggests to other people that women are, yes, important on Wall Street or important in the medical field or whatever it is. I think from my point of view, that's important. But it's more important to me, not as a woman person, but as a journalist person, that women are involved in the writing and shaping of through editing and news signing of stories, because there I do think it's just absolutely clear that the more no editor looks at the same set of news stories and comes up with the same menu of story options. And so you bring to the table what you're interested in, and you're just going to get a much more boring file if you have all men, all women, all white people, all anything, than if you have a range of views. So I think it matters, but for those two different reasons.
Which are both great reasons, Jill.
Thanks, Linda. I think that I agree with you, Ruth, that they are two different things, but at the end of the day, if you have women reporters, they may be bringing a little something different about the way they look at a story. And if you are quoting women as opposed to just all men, you may get someone with a slightly different take on the issue at hand. But I think it's not just about men and women. I mean, you could have a newsroom full of women Ivy League graduates from upper middle class families, and they may have a similar take on things. You don't want that any more than you want all male, white newsrooms. I mean, I think it's about a diversity of backgrounds, not just men and women, but by race, by class, because then you never know what you're going to find. And I think one of the ways, as a former political reporter, that I've often seen some of this manifest itself is in presidential debates where, women in a room are interpreting something a lot different than men in a room, like, is that male presidential candidate being patronizing to the woman he's referring to right next to him? Whereas I think sometimes men don't always pick up on those cues. But anyway, I think it's about diversity all the way around.
Anna?
Yeah, I think it depends. For me as a reporter, you're up on the hill, you're competing to get the best stories possible. So you're looking to get the best sources possible. So while I think it's important that you're including and you're looking at a diverse range of sources to get the best information, it's less about, do I have 5 women and 3 men being quoted in a story? I think you're just trying to do the best job possible. And a lot of the times you're looking at not only just men, but white older men who are members of Congress. So I think you have to seek out those stories, but certainly you're going to be getting a different point of view from different kind of where people come regionally, where they come from in terms of age. And I think when you look at, as Congress has gotten more diverse, you have more women chairmen in the House than there ever been before. There's more opportunities to kind of have the natural inclination the person you should be going to is going to be a woman.
I'd like to piggyback on some of the things Jill said as far as it's not enough just to have a certain group of people around a table in a newsroom, that within that group there needs to be a diversity of views. But in a very simple way, women, as far as being part of stories, are sometimes the best and only way to tell stories. An economic story told from a women's point of view, from a working mother's point of view, is going to be a completely different and better story and give you a much better picture. You can't talk about poverty without talking about women's issues. You can't talk about health care. And to ignore that, and one of the reasons why, and somebody mentioned this earlier, it's so important to have those voices at the table when decisions about stories are being made is in that room. That is the most important place to be in a newsroom. And the more people you can have in management there, which starts to change a culture of a newsroom, the better. NBC News has the privilege of saying that we have the first news division president of a large news organization, broadcast, ever in the country. 6 months ago, we brought in Deborah Turnus from Britain, from ITN, to be our news division president. Beyond that, her boss, who's the president of the news group, is a woman named Pat Philly-Cruchel, who's basically in charge of NBC News, MSNBC, and CNBC. And there's a culture that's not that it's better or worse, but it's different. And you can bet when we talk about stories, her point of view helps drive the day. It helps start discussions that we may not have had otherwise. So it's critical. It's terribly important to all the other voices that are at the table.
Well, it might be interesting to take a look at where the journalists come from and the news decision makers, because as a professor, I know the majority of my students are women, and actually nationwide it's 64% of students enrolled in bachelor programs for journalism and mass communication are women, and the number is 67% in graduate programs. And yet in newsrooms, they continue to be about 2/3 male. And the increase in female supervisors has stayed at about 37% for the last 15 years. So what are we doing to get those women who are graduating from J school, although that's not the only way to become a journalist, into the newsroom and into these decision-making positions? Matt, I think you've had a lot of success with this at Bloomberg that you could share with us.
Yeah, I mean, it was part of a very broad strategy that addressed the content that we were creating, which is making sure that the voices increasingly were often as much women as men. But it also was how to make sure that the abundance of talent that we see at the entry level is there at the top. And the only way we could achieve that is by having literally a strategy that said we are going to organize ourselves in such a way, or reorganize ourselves in such a way so it's possible for there to be at the very top of the organization people who have been there, done that, who happen to be women, so that they are exemplars and make it a lot easier for everybody who is entering and succeeding and striving to recognize that a career doesn't end after 10 years. A career doesn't end when you want to make a family decision. In fact, just the opposite, that there is an encouragement of people having families with the understanding, even the guarantee, that the position that you had not only will be waiting for you, but probably an even better position awaits you along the way. And that can only happen if it's a conscious policy and has specific goals every year, numerical goals, and it can be measured, and you can tell pretty much how much progress you're making. So that is something that we started to do about 3.5 years ago, and pleased to say that it began really with someone who was here tonight, Lisa Kassenauer, who was really an agent for positive change. But it also started with an executive editor, someone who has been there, done that, Amanda Bennett, who I think is here in the audience. And it fortunately got louder and bigger and better to the point where in the past 3 years, we've tripled the number of women who are team leaders at Bloomberg News. More than 50% of the headcount at Bloomberg News now reports to a woman. With that result, more women managing editors are in more places around the world. I want to come back to one more thing about the content that Ruth raised, which speaks to this issue. I think everybody in this room may have heard of Prime Minister Abe, who is leading Japan at the moment. And the term Abenomics has been coined because of his dramatic departure from economic policies of his predecessors. A cornerstone of Abenomics comes from a woman who is American, who lives in Tokyo, who is a senior portfolio strategist at Goldman Sachs. In fact, she is the only woman among hundreds of senior portfolio strategists in Japan. And in the 90s, she developed something that was called Womenomics. And Womenomics is based on two things that I alluded to earlier, which is one, if women have all the freedom to work, to succeed, they actually have simultaneously the freedom to create families too. They go together. And so she showed this over and over again in the 90s. Wasn't, by the way, something that was widely picked up, but it was definitely a big story. And it was a story that we made a commitment to cover, in part because we had this initiative, and we said, well, we're trying to do all these things. And lo and behold, 15 years ago, there was somebody who was already onto this with her own research. Kathy Matsui is who I'm talking about, who was at Goldman Sachs. Anyway, Prime Minister Abe now says what is so important for Japan, especially to deal with its demographic problems, is to have a policy of womenomics. So here's an example where the story is a great story. It happens to dovetail with something that we're doing that is the Women's Initiative. Sorry to be so long-winded.
That's fine. And we have an empty seat up here, I think 2 in the front, or several. If anyone's looking for a seat, why don't you raise your hand if there's an empty seat next to you, and if there's anybody in the back that wants to move on up. And while you're finding seats, I wanted to turn to Sally to follow up on the question of women in the news decision-making end of things.
Sure.
As a bureau chief, I mean, when I started with the AP, which was a few decades ago, the top management was all male. The bureau chiefs were all male, too, at that point.
Yes.
And
I think that's probably true.
what opened the door for you, and what's made a difference?
I mean, like any person ever, I had great mentors all along the way. Some of them were men and some of them were women. And that's how you get ahead in your careers. People help you and they support you and they teach you. And it's really interesting because I think, listening to Matt, I think AP has been much less systematic about this than Bloomberg. And I think there's huge benefit to a systematic approach. But let me touch on something we were talking about in the room before we came out here. I think one other just really critical thing is to have women in leadership positions, because I think that if you don't have a systematic approach, that creates an organic approach, which can be very helpful. At the moment, I've really been trying to think about my own organization. We are very rich with women leaders. There are parts of our organization that I think are lacking. I was thinking about our investigative reporting crew, which is very dominated by men. Although I head it, so, but I mean, the reporters are mostly men. Our political reporting crew right at this moment in time is quite dominated by men, although we, up until recently, had a female political editor, and that's cyclical. A couple presidential election cycles ago, we had all of our reporters who were on the bus were women. So there are some cycles in this. But to answer the question directly, I had a lot of great mentors along the way who supported me. Specifically, when I was at the point where I wanted to have children, I had a female bureau chief who let me quit and come back several times. I actually, in my case, it was just kind of an anomaly. I quit because I wanted to go live overseas for a while, and it was just a different situation. I actually wanted to quit. But when I came back with children in tow and a desire to work really hard, she was very welcoming to me. And I do think Matt's totally right that the ability to have cycles in your career, I'm sure it's important for men too, but it is in many cases critically important for women. There was a time in my life, it's kind of a bizarre story, but I'm just going to throw it out there because I think it's actually, so there was a time in my life, I was probably 33 or 34. I was living in Saudi Arabia. I was not working. I had 2 infant children. And I thought, my career is dead. I am never, ever getting back into this industry. I'm going to go back to Washington, and who is going to employ me, right? I took a total of about 4 years off over some, and I just thought, I've just completely killed my career, and I was very depressed about it. And I came back, and through the support of a lot of people here, I was able to pick it up again. And I think one thing that is wonderful about this industry is that merit does rise. You know, we do tend to be, in some ways, a very meritocratic sort of industry. And, you know, our executive editor at the moment is a woman. I don't think that she has any sort of systematic approach, but I do think that, like any person in the entire world, people tend, even if they're trying very hard not to, they tend to hire people who are like them, or that they are something that they see that reminds them of when they were young or something like that. And I told another story. I had a moment of epiphany once when I was overseas, where my boss, I was in Cairo, I was responsible for the Middle East. My boss was trying to hire a war correspondent for us for one of the really nasty places in the Middle East. And when we were interviewing people, he was reminiscing about how much this person who he was thinking of hiring reminded him of him when he had gone out to war zones when he was young. And I was like, wow, that is just so indicative of how people look for what they remember, right? So I do think that having women in leadership positions, or black guys in leadership positions, does help make sure that you get a diverse pool of candidates. And I think that is, if you don't have a systematic approach, and I actually deeply admire a systematic approach, but if for some reason you don't have a systematic approach, then getting a couple of people in hiring positions who are diverse has enormous power. And I think that's what I would say more than anything. I just want to really echo something that Ken said, because I feel this very, very strongly. I feel that there is a woman challenge in journalism in the United States today and globally. I also feel that there's a massive diversity challenge. And I think that any conversation that we would have, whether it's because of the economics of the industry or whether it's because people use that as an excuse, I do think that that is something that we just can't sit up here as panelists and not talk about that issue. Because that, to me, in my day-to-day life in my newsroom, is something that I worry about actually even more than a gender gap, to be perfectly frank. So.
Can I mention one thing?
Yes.
One of the things that I think has been very instructive to me is that, and I don't think I'm overstating it, and I would welcome anybody to chime in, there is, to me, a true sense that the challenge for women, especially moving into management, is much different, and I would argue harder than it is for men. Because at some point, if a man gets divorced, not an issue.
Right.
If a man's wife has a kid, not an issue. One of the things that I've had to learn is that there's a difference that it matters, and you have to have that sensitivity to understand. The workplace has to be an environment where if someone says, can I work 4 days a week? If you're not even willing to have that discussion as an employer, you're going to lose good women. The nature of news, especially as women move through the ranks of management or become reporters, things like that, the nature of news for somebody to be considered good is the moment something happens, they're out the door. Mm-hmm. If you have kids, can you really be out the door without considering what your child care plans are? And so to acknowledge that the playing field is level is to be a little disingenuous. It's harder, I feel that way. And I've tried to create an environment, and we've tried to create an environment where we can try to figure out how to make those things work, whether it's flexible scheduling or somebody's going to work 4 days a week. But to not acknowledge that challenge exists is somewhat disingenuous. I've worked in a newsroom once where there were a lot of women in management, but then somebody mentioned to me what the common denominators were in some of those, and this was maybe about 10 years ago. One wasn't married, one had adult children, one was divorced. I mean, the challenges are different. There was one who had young children, but I think when you, and I'm interested to hear what other people think, when you get to that point in your life, I think it's, and my wife was a journalist, and at some point we had this long, gut-wrenching conversation when we had our first child about what she wanted to do. Could she go back to work part-time? And if your company doesn't allow that, then what?
Yeah.
And so part of the solution to the problem is, what are employers doing to make it a more workable environment if you want to go away and come back? And what do we do to erase this stigma that if you can't get out the door immediately and go to the war zone and drop what you're doing and forget about your family, you know, the people who get the tag as being successful are the ones who just drop everything. And of course, not realizing in some cases it's a woman who's basically picking up everything they've dropped at home to carry the rest of the load. So I think that's part of it, is the culture of business generally, but specifically television, where we thrive on breaking news and being able to do something at an instant and go anywhere at an instant.
And that comes back to changing the culture, and we know this also touches on an issue which is getting a lot of legislative attention right now about women in the workplace and having that flexibility. But it's interesting, when we do get more women out in the field and reporting, does it make a difference in the number of sources that are women, et cetera? And apparently women, according to the research I found from the Women's Media Center and the Global Media Monitoring Project and the IWMF and others, they tend to quote more women in their stories, but still probably only about a fourth at the most. And one woman, Adrienne LaFrance, decided to do a study earlier, well, it was last year, of her own stories over a period of time. And she's written for the Washington Post, Denver Post, Fast Company, and elsewhere, and was surprised to find that of 52 of her 136 articles, those 52 quoted no women at all. And so sometimes maybe just the fact that you're a woman doesn't mean that you're also getting more women's sources. And so it comes to the point you raised, Anna, when you're out there trying to grab that quote, and I'm sure, Jill, you've run into this, and Ruth on the Hill in your out there days. What are the blocks to getting more women in your reporting?
I think it is important to, and I actually made this in the last year, a real commitment to myself to try to get more sources. I've covered money and politics and lobbying, which is a heavily dominated male industry for forever. And so I think the stumbling blocks are, some of them are stereotypical. There are a lot of women who they say they don't have the time to talk to you, or they don't want to have their name out there in front. And that there are men that do that too, but I think when you're trying to grow this, I found that, you know, maybe it's 1 out of 4 that you can really cultivate, whereas where there are a lot of men who have been doing this for 20 years who like to have their name out there, you know, kind of very stereotypical. The only thing I wanted to piggyback, because I actually think being at Politico and being at a 7-year-old company, and you guys talk about you're at the AP, which has obviously been around for a long, long time, and Politico kind of gets a bad rap, I think, as being a male-dominated place. But if you look at the leadership that has kind of come into place over the last several years, there are a lot of senior women in the ranks. And I think it does make a difference. I think that it has been a real culture change, and that has been embraced at the organization, and kind of in the last year doing Women Rule, which was a whole series of panels all about women, and kind of embracing that is just something that I'm really proud that we've done.
Can I jump in on the sourcing issue? So
You've been on both sides.
yeah, so I had 3 things that really kind of, you had to, if you were going to get in my story, you had to know what you're talking about, you had to be really quotable and colorful, and you had to be available. Now, who is more available? I think, I mean, this may sound a little stereotypical, but I think the men are often more self-promotional and available than a lot of the women are. So you have to kind of work at it. So people have to sort of meet those criteria, and then oftentimes the women fall away. So, you know, as a reporter, I was conscious of it and I tried, but at the end of the day, when you know that one political science professor is always going to call you back because you have his home, his cell, and his work, and, you know, whatever other, his vacation home phone number that you can get him, that we're all busy. You know, when I wrapped up my career, I was on morning radio 5 mornings a week at 6:30 in the morning. I was on MSNBC just about every single day. I was blogging and I was writing my stories. And thank God Twitter didn't exist then, because I didn't have to do that. But those were a lot of what went into it. So you really have to, if you're not consciously thinking about it and trying to push to get women into your stories or other people rather than the same old voices, it's just not going to happen.
Can I say one quick thing about that? I think that there's a couple different ways in which the growth of women in stories occurs. One is, you know, and the best way is organically, because you've got a woman-fed chief, you've got, you know, 2 of the most powerful women in the people in the Democratic Party are women. You've got really significant cadre of women senators who I would suggest probably get more of their share of coverage than men, partly because many of them are willing to really put themselves out there. And I think it's also true that just as the guy reporters, and this is going to sound totally stereotypical, bond with sources and over sports talk, there is a way in which I think women reporters have a certain kind of bond with women's sources, and that once you become aware of it, you've got your bond with folks and you talk about things. I have lots of sources that I've talked about kids stuff with because and juggling things, and because that's a bond. But I think that the best way for it to happen is the organic way, in that as the round up the usual suspects tendency, which we all fall back on Deadline, when more of the usual suspects are women, then we're in way, way better shape.
I think there's a third way. And again, it's part of a strategy, which is there is a paucity, sadly, of women voices in every profession. Now, when you look at the data, you find increasingly, whether it's law, medicine, to name 2, that women are rapidly overtaking men as professionals. And these aren't the only 2 professions where this is true. So how does one go about getting women voices into our reporting? And our experience has been, if we identify the women in the first place who are protagonists, who are doing things, and commit ourselves to reporting on what they've done, because their achievements are worth reporting on, it gets us that much closer to getting to the point where they will become themselves voices. And I can give you a couple examples. We have a hyperactive executive editor for the economy and government in Washington, Dan Moss, who has been all over the world for us. And he conceived a series of stories last year about women in economics, real achievers, go-getters, extraordinary. I mean, these are people that are on the Madame Curie level of excellence. And one of the stories, by the way, that came out of this was an MIT economist, Finkelstein, who happens to be a reigning authority on healthcare, someone who is constantly, timely, isn't it? Someone who is constantly invoked in the whole debate about Obamacare, healthcare, and so on and so forth. Anyway, that story and this person as a source wouldn't have happened had we not gone out of our way to say, okay, where are they? And clearly they're doing things that are extraordinary, that are worth reporting on anyway, and they've been overlooked. And once you get to that point, you've literally broken the dam or you've broken the ice, and you've established context maybe for life. And here's hoping. And one good source begets another good source. One good story begets another story.
Are there other examples of within your organizations that you found are working to develop more diversified source lists? I hope everyone's familiar with SheSource, which I don't say quickly too much. Yes, the Women's Media Center is over 700 women experts they've vetted, and they make sure they're available or try to. But any other strategies you found to go past the don't have time, this person I know will give me the exact quote I want? Like Matt said, investing those kinds of resources that have worked at your organizations. Ken?
I think from a TV perspective, it just makes sense. What section of our population watches TV news more, men or women? Women. We would be stupid to not say to ourselves, why would we have, and especially when you're in Washington, you have to break away from this very familiar, I would jokingly tell people, let's do a story where not every single person is a white guy in a tie. And I don't mean to be disrespectful of my friends who are white guys in ties, but in Washington, yes, of course. But in Washington, it's easy to do. And so to some degree, you have to make a concerted effort to get outside of that. And your company has to acknowledge that they want you to make that effort. And it's really tricky and you have to do it when you're not under deadline. That's where we make the mistake. We say, yes, I'm going to do it, I'm going to do it, I'm going to do it. And of course, the show comes on at 6:30 and you find out you need an interview at 5 o'clock. You're not going to go, okay, let me go get the book. Let me see. You've got to figure out how do you develop those sources when you're having a slow news day. I'm going to go down to whatever hospital. I'm going to go call the press person there and say, you know what? We really want to bring new faces into our discussion. Do you have any doctors? Do you have any African American? Do you have any women? Do you have any? Introduce me to some people because we want more people to be able to tell that story. And heaven forbid they happen to have a point of view that you hadn't really thought about before because the person you've been using for so long says the same thing over and over and over again. But if we don't make that effort, if your company does not set a culture where we expect that, then it's just too easy because everybody can say, well, did you not want me to make my slot on time? Did you want the story to fail? So you have to do that outside of when it's breaking news, or else it's not going to work. But part of it is just putting it as part of the culture, part of your mindset, to kind of make it a challenge that we want to have somebody who's different. I remember the first time we had somebody, I think, on one of our broadcasts who was Sikh. And the story had nothing to do with terrorism, immigration. He was a doctor. And I was like, this is good. This is what America is supposed to look like. And the thing was, I think in that case, I didn't work on the story, but it may have been where it just happened that way, or somebody made the point to do it, but it stuck out in my mind that we should do more of that. There are tons of opportunities like that. We have to go get them. And as TV and as journalism generally becomes more fiscally constrained, it's harder sometimes to find that person who might be in Minnesota. Do you have a bureau in Minnesota? No. Do you want to spend it? But we have to find ways to get around that. The technology now allows us to do that. Somebody can get on Skype and do that. The technology is enough. It's good enough now that we can do that without having to say, well, if we can't get a satellite truck over there and a good camera, no. That is not an excuse anymore.
I'd just like to piggyback off that. Because I also think my other pet peeve is when you only think about women or you only quote women for women's stories. You look at the war against women, and then you have every party committee, both Democrat and Republican, putting out their deputy woman, spokesperson instead of the male head of the office. And so I think you also have to kind of be cognizant that you're going for the interesting story. You're having the person who is just great for the story, not just because they can speak to some issue.
I think that's a really important point, and I love, Ken, everything that you said about the desire, but I think, and particularly in television, because it is such a visual medium, certainly the kinds of television that I end up doing, there is this sense of the slot. There is the women's slot, and not just the women's slot, but it's like when I get called to do Sunday shows, it is because I can write, as my editor once said to me, a column as boring as any man. I can write about the debt. I can write about tax reform. I can write about politics. But I tend to get called for Sunday shows when it's Hillary Clinton time or war on women time. And I don't ever argue. I just say, yes, thank you very much. When is the car coming? Because in the hopes, actually, that you all will think of me at other times than that. But it's not. I'm not picking on NBC in any way. It is a cross network phenomenon, and human nature probably.
And the thing is that organizations have to be willing to get outside of that comfort zone of people they don't know. And part of that is, especially from a TV standpoint, there does need to be an expectation that the person is able to communicate well. We don't want to put anybody on who just doesn't deliver the message well. And so part of that is, I think that our organization does a good job about this. While there may be a sense, sure, here's an issue specific to women, so here's somebody who really knows that issue, but realizing that at some point, you know what, they know a lot of other stuff. Let's call them for that guy issue. Or let's call them for that other issue that's not necessarily their specialty. And I think that has to develop, but a news organization has to want to develop that and not just go to the old reliable, this person talks about this issue.
Well, it's interesting because there was one study that found that in stories on contraception, abortion, reproductive issues, male experts were quoted more than women. So sometimes you do wonder. But some years ago, I remember hearing USA Today, I don't know if there's anybody here who can fill us in on this, but they had a quasi-quota system about, it was when Karen Jorgensen was editor, about making sure they had women quoted in stories. So I'm just curious whether is a quota system the way to do it? I mean, how would you feel, Sally, about requiring your reporters to have a certain number of...
There was another newspaper, because I was talking to one of the editors in my, I'm not familiar with the USA Today example, but there was one of my women editors in my office was talking about, I don't know if it was, I'm trying to think what it was, if it was Charlotte or something like that had an experiment with that, a couple.
Or it might be, like, speaking of the TV also, Chris Hayes in his show says that if they have 4 people on, he wants 2 of them to be women.
Right. I don't know. I mean, again, I don't personally kind of like the quota idea, but I do actually, I think in many of the things that we're talking about, there is both an organic path and a systematic path. I mean, Ruth is completely right that, there's a Fed, head of the Fed, and, there's going to be more women quoted about economics because, I mean, she's the most important economic voice in the country. All of a sudden, the number of women who are quoted in economic stories is going to skyrocket. So there's definitely an organic component to this. The flip of that was I was talking to our Latin America regional editor this morning, knowing that I was coming to this panel, and they have a lot of, obviously, women leaders in Latin America. And I asked her, is this a problem for you guys? And she said, well, every woman leader in Latin America is surrounded by a bunch of male aides, basically, and so she goes, I don't think it's actually increased our, how many women we quote at all, really, frankly, because they're all just surrounded by lots of guys. So there's definitely an organic component. But I also do think that, we live in a society where, Wall Street is still slanted greatly toward men, but there are lots of professions in our society where there are very, very, very competent women who are rising through the ranks, and that is obviously a trend that is going to keep going. And so I do feel, as I thought about this more, there are parts of our coverage where we're just not making any effort at all and we're not paying any attention at all. So I do like the idea of effort. I don't know that I would do a quota system because I think quota systems are hard to explain. But I do very much think that what is really important is that women be asked to comment on stories, in my opinion, that have nothing to do with women's issues. That, to me, is really the breakthrough. Of course, we should be seeking women's comment on issues that are of concern to them. But you're really getting, gender blind when you just kind of reach out for the best person to comment on this story. And that, to me, seems like the real breakthrough point. There was this, I heard this woman senator recently tell an off-the-record story about a recent thing that came up in the Senate. I think this is just so indicative of the challenge in any industry. She said that, as you know, there was a woman senator on one side of the military sex assault issue and another woman senator on the other side of the military sex assault issue, right? So it was a woman's issue, and two of the most prominent women in the Senate were on different sides of this issue. And she said she thought it just absolutely flummoxed all the guy senators. They were like, what's our position supposed to be on this if we're trying to be sensitive? And she said it was such a learning moment for them, because it was that people could, smart women could disagree about the best way to address an issue. It was pretty interesting, I think. And I think that's what, when you're really getting to a sophisticated, analogy in journalism of really capturing that. So,
I'd just like to say, in our experience, a very successful approach to significantly increase the women experts who are cited and referred to without any difficulty is to go directly to the companies and the institutions and to say, can we please have all of your authorities, if you will. And surprisingly, there is a willingness, if not embarrassment, when we explain why we're seeking these people, because we want to do justice to the subject. And if there are, for example, a significant percentage of women at a bank who are in a position to comment on all sorts of things, why shouldn't they be visible? And it turns out that the bank, recognizing that it would be politically correct if they volunteered this information than not, they do. So there is a way to unlock, if you will, the resources. There is a way to get the keys to the temple and get the wisdom from the temple. And this is something that we have increasingly done, and it's served us well.
One of the things that I think it was about 10 years ago when, all the think tanks put out a book of their experts. And at some point, they started putting out pictures, which was the smartest thing that think tank could have done. Because I don't know that Michael Jones or names that are Sydney. Is Sydney a male or a woman? You don't know that. And so, but it really helps us get started. It helps us, what I talked about earlier about saying, on a day when it's not busy, I'm going to call this person and say, hey, if a story comes up about this issue, I want to be able to call you, and it may be on short notice. I may not have a lot of flexibility. Can you come here? You have to set up this. You have to set up your own scenario for success, because breaking news will not help you. You will go back to what you know. But part of it really, as far as reporting comes down to, it really does require you to get outside of what is easy, which is not what TV or journalists generally do. Most journalists are just trying to get to that deadline for the day, period. It's 6:30, the newscast is over, I'm done. And don't want to take that extra amount of time to go, now let me go do some other work that might help me later on, 2 years from now, or 2 months from now.
Of course, they're never really done today because they're supposed to be tweeting, and
Right.
if you're tweeting here, we are hashtag misquote NPC. But coming back to, Matt referred to getting the keys to the temple, or, Ken, you can look and see that these are good sources at whatever institute or organization. But getting those women to talk, getting them to submit op-eds, what are we doing about that, or what can we do to improve that end of it?
Well, here is where I summon my inner Sheryl Sandberg and say, who I think has just really done a terrific service to the country and the world in talking about the importance of leaning in, because if you need to be willing, particularly as a op-ed columnist or an op-ed writer, to put yourself out there. And you need to also be willing to just say yes when somebody asks you to. I checked in to make sure that this was still true with our, in parentheses, woman op-ed editor this afternoon. And it has been true for years. She says it may be slightly less true now, but it's still true that the overwhelming majority of the submissions that we get over the transom are from men. You know what? It turns out if you don't submit an op-ed to the Washington Post, it doesn't get published in the Washington Post. Funny how that works. And there is still a tendency among women, I kind of, there is a sweetness to it, right? Because, but the tendency among women in various fields of expertise, when the editor calls and says, okay, Ariel Sharon just died, can you write 750 words in the next hour and a half, right? The traditional thing, and it's a stereotype, but it's more true than not, is the guy says, yes, you know, how do you want it in word form or do you want it in the body of the email? And the woman is like, oh God, I don't know, I've got to think and let it marinate, make sure it's okay. No. You just have to say, yes, thank you very much, I'll get it done, and do it. And you have to steel yourself for the reaction, which is some people are going to say that you're stupid. Some people are going to say that you made no sense. Some people are going to say you're great, but they probably don't know what they're talking about. It's the people who said you're stupid who really know what's going on. So you're going to worry about yourself. Keep that all to yourself, right? Just say yes. And so there's a supply side and a demand side. The demand side has to be looking for different voices and being very aware on the round table or on the op-ed page that there's a diversity of views and a diversity of voices, whether it's racial diversity or other kinds of ethnic diversity or gender diversity. But we as women need to do our part to be willing, when that call comes or even when it doesn't come, to put yourself forward. There's a particular paucity of people like me, which is to say women columnists, because if you look at most op-ed pages, most regular columnists are white guys. And I think I have a long theory about the reason for this, but it kind of boils down to grades. It is not possible to write a column once or twice a week and get an A on every column. And my husband knows that he can make me break out in hives by saying, okay, I think this one is a B+. You know, and then I start arguing, no, it's really better than that. Could it be a B+, A-? And you just have to, women, E.J. Dionne says I'm wrong about this and that he really cares about his grades also. But women are used to being, I'm being a little stereotypical here, but women are used to being good students, right? People who are on the columnist track. We really care about doing well. We really want everything we write to be so good. And then you have to sometimes be willing to settle for less than perfection. I settle for less than perfection twice a week these days. I'll be settling for less than perfection tomorrow morning. But if you're not willing to do that and just not willing to take the risk that sometimes you're going to look like an idiot and sometimes you're going to fall flat on your face and sometimes maybe you'll strike a chord with people. If you're not willing to take that risk and also to just take the risk of the abuse you get when you're a columnist, because people disagree. Turns out if you have opinions, people disagree with them. You're not going to be out there. And it makes me so crazy every time I'm in the White House for a briefing of columnists. And I'm in the Roosevelt Room, and I look around the table, and often it's on an economic topic, so it tends to be particularly a male crowd. And I look around and I go, holy cow, I'm the only girl here. And it's not the White House's fault because they haven't called other folks. It's our fault in journalism that we haven't produced more other people more like me.
Well, we wish we had the formula. And there are some programs, training programs, the Op-Ed Project, Women's Media Center, and other organizations, IWMF, that are, and also some organizations institutionally. I'm sure, Matt, you've heard of, corporations institutionally that are trying to get their women, as you mentioned, trained and out there. And when you worked at DOT, you probably ran into this, or with clients you work with now. Have you found some strategies?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, going to the Department of Transportation was sort of like, it was a real culture shock because it is a completely male-dominated field. I mean, journalism is like awash in women compared to transportation, and when I was there, it was really a matter of finding the most appropriate person who could speak in English and not in transportation speak, and not just go off into the weeds. And I had this experience when I joined SKDKnickerbocker, working with a client with a complicated safety problem. And what I found was a senior woman felt more comfortable deferring to a man who was an expert in this very complex area, putting him on TV. He had had no media training. He had never been on TV before. He probably never spoke to a journalist before in his life. And it was a complete disaster. And afterwards, when I was brought in on this, I said to the woman, you have to do this. I know you're scared of this subject, but you are the pro. You're the person who knows how to boil it down and communicate a safety message. You have to get up to speed on this and do it. You can't ever let someone like that do this again, because I know that kind of person, because that's what, there were like 55,000 employees at the Department of Transportation, and I would say 54,990 of them were kind of like that kind of person. So, a lot of times women, their instinct may be to defer, and I know that's a generalization, but I feel like I've seen that a lot.
And of course, as they have more role models, seeing those other women quoted, maybe it will start to make a difference. I'm going to start with some questions from you all pretty soon, but I wanted quickly on this topic, when Ruth mentioned criticism and women being a little bit wary. So there's been a lot of recent buzz about, especially online, women coming in for more vitriol, and I thought, well, you all live online, but Anna in particularly is from that world, and how that might be actually discouraging, right, this time that we want more women's voices out there.
Yeah, I've actually talked about this with a couple of my colleagues, and I think, one, the people who are most at risk for getting the real kind of haters that come out is when you put your opinion, because I think when you're someone like me, you kind of have a little bit step removed, because it's really, you're covering the process, you're covering maybe a hot button issue, but it's less about what Anna Palmer thinks about something and more about what's happening in the world, whereas you're kind of taking on an issue and really kind of pushing it. And so from that perspective, I think that is there. But I also think when you are looking for someone to quote someone, you're asking them to put themselves out there. I mean, because you're not, like you said earlier, Jill, like, you're not looking for the boring, this is what my company thinks, blah, blah, blah. It's like, no, you want some sass, you want some pizzazz, otherwise no one's going to, read your article. And so when you're looking for that, you're also trying to find kind of the people that are comfortable in their own skin and willing to, be hit on the hand or get a bunch of emails even from people they know that are going to question what they might have said.
So we need to get tougher skins too.
Well, I really think that what Ruth said is a very, very valuable lesson for people going into any part of journalism. I mean, it is a rough and tumble. It can be rough and tumble. There can be things, everybody gets hate online, and it is actually quite distressing, whether you're getting it for, whatever reason, whatever color of skin you have or whatever gender you are. And I do think there's a certain toughness that you have to develop. I don't mean a physical toughness or you lose touch with the world or anything like that. But I think the most valuable thing, presumably this is a room of people who are interested in journalism careers, the best thing you can ever do in your career is take risks. I mean, and just, be prepared to fail, be prepared to get the C on your editorial or your column. Really try new things or whatever. I'm sure Ruth never got a C, but, really that is, and this is not a blame ourselves issue at all. These are things we all struggle with. We all struggle with, I have a safe job, should I take a more challenging, risky job? We all struggle with that. Men struggle with that, everybody struggles with that. But there is really, the best thing you can say to your colleagues, the best thing you can say to your peers, the best thing you can say to your friends is take the risk and get the growth, because that's really what propels you forward. It's really an amazing, it may not even sound politically correct to this audience, I don't know, but it's really an amazing lesson to say. Risk is worth it. That's what gets you where you want to get.
Did you want to add something, Ken, before we?
I just want to add one thing which I have found is very helpful from a diversity standpoint, which is when you come into an organization, every organization has its own culture. And one of the things that I find is very difficult is people, especially who are not in the majority of that culture, is that the biggest problem is trying to navigate personalities, trying to navigate how to manage up, trying to navigate a room full of people who all are trying to get to the top when you may be the least like them. And it's difficult. It's a thing that they don't really teach you in school. To some degree, you can be the best journalist, but if you cannot figure out how to go to the managing editor, the news director, and plead your case, if you cannot figure out that pride goeth before the fall, if you cannot figure that out, and it's difficult because many of us come from very proud families and proud or schools, and we think that we know how to do things the right way, and that's the only way, that's how I learned it. Journalism is like, to me, and this is probably a bad metaphor because I don't cook, but it's like making cookies, which is like when you leave school or when you leave your first job, you get the basics of making a cookie. You need butter, you need milk, you need eggs. I'm probably forgetting something because I don't make cookies. But flour, okay. And to some degree, that is like the basics of journalism. But every place you go and take a job, they may make their cookies a little different. And the first thing you have to do, and that is understanding that culture. How do they make their cookies? Without having a sense that you've sold out, kissed up, or feel like you're playing some game. It's going to happen everywhere you go, and it's more challenging in newsrooms because in newsrooms there's lots of egos and personalities. And if you can't navigate that, if you can't accept, that not everything is personal, that not everything means that somebody's out to get you or that they don't like you, then it's going to be a harder struggle. But ultimately, I do think, and somebody made this point earlier, nothing trumps being good at what you do. Nothing trumps that. And if you leave no room for error, if you've crossed every T and dotted every I, you're already off to a good start.
Those are inspiring words. I think we've got two people with microphones. So if you have a question, they'll pass you the mic.
Do you want to call on somebody, or do you want me to just?
Well, here's somebody right in the front row. And please give your name and affiliation when you ask the question so the panelist knows who you are.
Hi.
And you can address it to a specific panelist or everyone.
Rachel Oswald, a reporter with the National Journal. This is a question for the panel. We got at it a little bit earlier when you were talking about how most journalism school students are female, but then when you get into newsrooms, it's mostly men. And there's a little bit of discussion about, work-life balance, what do you do after you've had kids. But I think it's more than that. We were kind of getting a little bit about it when we were talking about leaning forward. But what do you think are some of the issues that cause really talented female journalists to exit the industry? My sense it has to do with a lot of the self-promotion. I personally feel uncomfortable with it, but I know it's what is needed, and how can we encourage more young journalists to improve their self-promotion abilities?
Matt, have you had retention issues with people that you tried to persuade to stay?
The biggest challenge for us has been more family related, as opposed to a person's visibility. And maybe that's because with us, probably the most valued or prized quality in our work is collaboration. And so what we revere is people working together. And so if people can work together, they succeed. As I said earlier, the hardest historic obstacle has been mostly women succeeding, deciding to have a family, and suddenly realizing that unless there is a clear path that awaits after beginning the process, it's very intimidating to go forward. And so what we committed ourselves to doing is eliminating as much as we could any evidence that there is an obstacle. And that required, as I said, to have fabulous role models all the way through, right up to the top, who could prove and demonstrate that this is not going to be an issue with us. And, I'd say happily, a lot of families have started with Bloomberg. We're about to enter our 25th year, and a lot of people started young and have grown older and wiser and more prosperous and more numerous with us. And the more we can continue that, the easier it is to attract people who stay with us. You know, and it's not, yeah.
Sorry, Ned, I just want to add to this. I'm Lisa Castanar from Bloomberg, and I've worked with Matt a lot on this in the last 3 years. And there's a point that I do want to make just to everyone, and that is how much all of this really also improves the work environment for men. The issue around, you know, being more open about people's family needs and all that kind of stuff is not just an issue for women in the newsroom at Bloomberg. It has also really provided an atmosphere that makes it easier for everybody who has family issues, who's looking at, you know, looking after older parents, who are looking after, you know, whatever your outside obligations might be, whoever you are. As soon as you start to address the fact that people do have other things going on in their lives, and that the workplace can be a place that recognizes that. We could start with it being a woman's thing, but it's really a thing for everybody. And I think we've really noticed that at Bloomberg in the last couple of years as we've talked about this stuff. It's there's tremendous goodwill about approaching all of these issues from men and women. So
I want to add one other thing. I mean, there are a lot of people leaving our industry, and that's actually, I think, a concern to a lot of us. It's a tough industry, and there's choices you have to make if you're going to stick with it, both because of the issues that Ken, I think, very smartly pointed out, which is that, when Israel invaded Gaza the day after Christmas, I was really, really annoyed. Okay, I mean, it was really in addition to all the other issues of it, was horrible. I mean, things happen at really awful times, and you've got a growing family. That is not a fun thing to have to juggle. There are more stable jobs in the world, let's put it that way, and obviously our industry has a lot of financial problems and a lot of having to move around for jobs and churn and things like that. But you're also in Washington, and there is a promotional aspect to getting ahead in journalism. That's just really true. I mean, there are parts of journalism where there's not a promotional aspect to getting ahead necessarily. There's deep, serious work that people do in parts of Washington or in parts of journalism where they're never on television, and the work is everything. But in this climate, yeah, there is. I mean, there can be, I'm sure Anna can talk about this. There is a very competitive environment in this city, in our industry, and that is something that you either like or you don't like, and you kind of have to come to terms with it. There's ways you can create a career that make circuits around that, but it is a part of our industry, and you either like it. I mean, Anna, you have some. I mean, I think you should talk about this a little bit. So.
Sure.
Well, the whole issue of branding. I used to think branding was about which detergent, but now it's.
Well, I think you have to go. I think I would say two things. One, I speak to college students, and I get very uncomfortable when you have a 19-year-old who says, how do I brand myself? Well, first of all, do some good work, and then you'll get recognized, and then you can kind of move on beyond that. But I would say, I think that, journalism has changed a lot. It's not just the story anymore. It's who's telling it. Are you doing it on air? Are you doing it through Twitter? It's a personal relationship, I think, that readers start to have with you. And frankly, raising your visibility, you get better stories. More people know you. But a lot of it, I think, has to start, and I'm hopefully believe that this is true of my work, that it starts with doing really good work and trying to, once you have that good work, then pushing it out and promoting it as much as possible.
There was a question over here. We hear from one of the few male voices in the audience. Yeah. This is like a typical journalism class.
Hi, Ken. You didn't say anything about guys with bow ties.
If you could introduce yourself.
But I'm amazed that none of the women...
I'm sorry, could you introduce yourself?
Oh, Hugh Grindstaff. This is my second gender minority event I've gone to today. The other one dealt with diplomats, and most of the diplomats here in D.C. are men. But this was But no one noticed that Angela is in Detroit covering an auto show. And there's two people she could interview today. One is the new head of GM, a woman, and one is the design engineer at Ford. So the sources, again, are becoming more and more gender equal. But sometimes what I've heard tonight is that the sources have to be women too. But isn't it the best person you get for the source? Is it a way of educating the sources that they need to be, you're dealing with that too a little bit. But
So I guess the question is, which I think we talked about a little bit earlier, how do you define who is the best person to go to on a story? Anybody want to jump in on that?
Well, yeah, I would just say, sadly, the reality is that there are far too many women who are the best sources, and they're not identified, they're not known. And so there has to be a concerted effort first to know who they are, where they are. And when we say sources, what we're really talking about is authorities, people who have accomplished a great deal. And there's so many women in so many different fields who are at the top of their profession. And I would say, unfortunately, there's far too much laziness, if I can call it that, just an unwillingness to make a concerted effort to find out who are they, where are they. And it is also true that, they're not going to just jump in front of us and say, here I am, I'm ready. We have to be part of the process that identifies them. And, and just to come to your example about GM, someone who literally started on the factory floor, spent her entire career at GM, and now she's, the CEO. Until really this year, very few people knew such a person existed at General Motors and was actually in the running to be the CEO. The only way you could know that is if you made a concerted effort to get to know Ackerson and what he was thinking about and where his priorities were. And then maybe you got some idea, which we did, by the way, by the summer, that she was, in fact, probably going to be the front runner for this position. But the only way you could know that is to make the effort in the first place to find that out, because it wasn't advertised.
I think there are 2 points to that. One is there's a distinction between sources and experts. If I'm when I worked on the Hill, trying to break a story in the finance committee and all of the senior finance aides are men,
That's what you're going to go to.
I'm just going to go to. I'm not going to sit there and go, okay, there's got to be a woman on the finance committee. But if I'm going to talk about a finance-related issue about taxes, I've got options. I've got senators, I've got members, I've got other options. So I think there's a distinction. I think part of it is it's just evolving. Like the auto industry is evolving. So you work with what you can do, but a good reporter always goes one layer beyond the obvious. When I was on the Hill, I never just stopped at the press shop. And that's where you find more diversity in people, more women, more minorities, the staff directors and things like that. But you got to work it besides when, it's a breaking news story and you just go to the usual suspects.
Sports reporting too.
Well, the statistics in sports reporting are fairly mind-boggling. A question right here.
Hello, my name is Gloria Brown Marshall, and I work in the area of law. I cover law. I'm a law professor at John Jay College in New York. I'm down here to cover the U.S. Supreme Court. And what I found was, as you've pointed out, the law classes may be 60 to 70% women. But when it comes to asking about legal issues, you really don't see women in the legal profession as the experts as much as you should, given the numbers. So one thing that I found that was helpful was to actually say, I cover constitutional law issues when I interacted with people. And along the line, little by little, there would be people, as you would say, they're not going to jump out at you, but sometimes they do, because people would look at me and not know I cover constitutional law issues and that I write books about the Constitution. And so when I talk to them, I have to make sure they know that I exist, and I have my card and I give it to them. But one thing I realized, they were using or inherited the same list of experts from the person who had the job before them. So they're going back to that same list again and again and again because they don't have the time to look. And so they just keep using the same in office, and I'll date myself by using the word Rolodex. So they're using that same list of experts from before. And I think it is important for people to kind of meet the journalists halfway and say, hey, I exist and I do have a point of view. But the second point is actually being open to that other point of view. Because although we may say, yes, we want that woman's point of view, sometimes do we really? Sometimes are we really open to that?
Well, the answer is actually, I would say the answer is you really do. And one good example, since she's already been invoked tonight, probably very few Americans recognize that the single best forecaster among the Fed governors was Janet Yellen. She had the best record of anyone on the Fed. But, you know, she wasn't the most quoted. She wasn't the most cited. She certainly didn't have the profile of Larry Summers. And yet, if you wanted someone who had perhaps the best sense of where the economy was headed, which is a pretty valuable attribute, one would have thought, it was none other than Janet Yellen. And so, you know, again, one had to know that. You had to go find that. And once you found it, then you say, well, she's clearly somebody we'd like to talk to. Now, getting her to talk is another matter, but it was important to know in the first place where she stood.
But I think you're raising an issue of you're someone who wants to be out there. You want to be recognized. How do you reach the reporters? And aside from the obvious, you know, hire a good PR firm, you know, there are things. There are things you can do, because what does a reporter do? There are a lot of reporters who just get thrown in on stories that they've never written about. I mean, I used to work Christmas week every single year, and you know, one year it was like mad cow disease that I was writing about. Like, I don't know anything about that stuff. So what do? You go to your computer and you type in mad cow disease, and you start looking at other things that have been written. Who's being quoted? So, or who's written an op-ed about it? Yeah. So the thing to do is, you know, write a blog post, write an op-ed, submit it to the newspaper, get your name out that way, so then other people are going to start calling you after that.
And it is a cycle, because you get your names on the op-ed page, you're more likely to get on the roundtables on the Sunday shows.
There's somebody in our office whose sole responsibility is to comb through newspapers and go, you know what, this guy sounded really smart on this. I'm going to hold this in my file. So when we get into a breaking news situation where we need somebody to talk about the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Courts and its impact on blah, 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 that we know somebody. So that it does start there. To say that there is not some requirement of self-promotion is to not be honest with you. It is required to some degree. And one of the things that I've found, that I've learned from having, our newsroom has a lot of really smart, helpful women who are helping me understand how to be a better manager to women, is that one of the mistakes I think we make, and this is a really important point, is that it's certainly the case in TV, and I'm curious to know if this is the case in print. The people who are the most type A seem to be the ones that everybody thinks are the superstars, versus the people who are not necessarily type A, but are more keep to themselves, more like a Janet Yellen type, who's not always looking, but are really, really smart. You still have to find a way, without changing your personality, to assert yourself. That doesn't mean you have to go and be a blowhard and use profanity like all the guys in the newsroom, but there does have to be a part of you that puts yourself out there to say, I want that next opportunity, I want that tough assignment, I want to make a sacrifice to do something. It is not, news is not white tablecloth service where somebody comes around and gives you things. It's a buffet, and you can go up there as much as you want. And you should.
It's okay to be a binge eater when it's news. Okay, that was probably in politics. Why don't we go to this side of the room? Whoever you're closest to.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Soraya Shamali, and I write about gender and media regularly. And we've talked a lot about what individuals can do, and I'm interested to hear more about systemic issues and whether your organizations do any training on implicit bias, stereotype threat. It's not really very popular to use words like racism and sexism, but they're relevant, I think. And so I'd like to understand a little bit more about how you personally deal with those things. in an environment where I think we really have upper limits on what we've been able to achieve through personal effort. So we are talking about the news, but the numbers we're talking about in terms of leadership are reflected in other media, television, movies. They're reflected in the corporate world. They're reflected in Congress. So if we take news and put it in the context of broader trends, do you see those things changing? Do you see them improving? Because those numbers have been pretty static for a while.
Are you talking about content and the kind of coverage, or?
I think they're related. So I'm talking about the fact that we have a lot of women who are great experts, a lot of women who can be sources, a lot of women who are writing, and that's all good, but we still have a cap on leadership and management, which seems to be very important. And we have that cap across media and government, and you work dynamically with all of these industries and fields. So in your experience, do you see that organically there's a trend that's changing, that we're going to hit a zeitgeist?
We heard from Matt about the systematic efforts that Bloomberg has successfully made, and Sally about the efforts that the AP has made. Anybody want to reinforce what's going on systematically at your organizations?
I mean, I think you're right that there's other parts of media, obviously, especially the entertainment industry, that are like kind of shocking and appalling. I can't speak for the entertainment industry. I think most efforts by companies are driven by self-interest, and it's sort of useful self-interest. I mean, we want to promote good people, and we do have some training. I don't know how effective it is. I think I certainly am very much personally in favor of systematic efforts and training, but I do think actually that any kind of work environment where there are people who are attuned to these issues and trying to make a change in a leadership position is very important. I said what I think. I think that if you care about the issue of women being represented in media, having women in hiring positions is the single most important thing you can do. I just fundamentally, after many years, believe that. So I do think none of us could say that we are where we want to be, but I do think, like, my organization is very likely to have the next executive editor be a woman too. And we're making some progress, I would say.
I would like to speak up for men in hiring positions for this reason. I've had just the blessing of an employer who, in my circumstance, has been incredibly solicitous and understanding of my need. I have kids who are teenagers now, but they didn't used to be teenagers not that long ago. And I had the executive editor of the newspaper say to me at one point, whatever you feel like you need to do to be a good mother, we are going to accommodate you. But it wasn't, I think, it wasn't as sort of a newsroom-wide institutional attitude. And I have found in my experience that actually when, much to my surprise, I came back to a female editor after my first child and said, guess what, I kind of want to work 4 days a week. Never occurred to me before. And she said, Ruth, being a reporter on the national staff of the Washington Post is a 5-day-a-week job. And I laughed at her and said, that's ridiculous. It's a 7-day-a-week job. So is being a lawyer. So is everything else. Let's get with the program. She knew she was going to say yes to me because we had a culture of saying yes to those things. And I understood her issues. It messed up her slots. She wasn't going to get anybody else. It was a problem for her. I found the men editors to be actually way more accommodating. Years later, an editor in her exact position came to me and said, okay, I hear you're wanting to work 3 days a week. What I want you to do is try going on the desk. And I said, well, that's ridiculous because I can't work those out that late. And he said, it's okay. You're not going to do breaking news. When you get home, when you're done with your work at 6 o'clock, you're going to get up and go home. And of course, it turned out that when the the disputed election of 2000 happened and we were in the office for the next 36 days, I was there for the next 36 days, as he knew I would be. But it was his flexibility that allowed me to...
No, I totally agree. I do think it's an issue of being attuned to these issues. It's not, and I actually had a female boss who was I'm sorry, I know this is being taped, but I'll say a bad word. She was a hard ass. I mean, she was completely unsympathetic to these things. I mean, she'd clawed her way up, and she didn't think it was her role to, she thought it was her role to toughen us. And now, actually, that was useful. I'll say that. Okay, but it's not really the way that I want to be a woman leader. So, I can't really give you an answer. I mean, I personally am somewhat hopeful about the future, but I'm just speaking personally. I don't know that there's any studies to back me up or anything. So,
well, in the studies that we've seen in all the areas we're addressing, there have been incremental increases, but we're not where any of us think we should be. Over here, I guess. Nicole can pass it to whoever grabs it.
Thank you. I got one back here. Erin Mattson, I'm an editor-at-large with RH Reality Check, and I want to go back to something that Ruth had said about the overwhelming majority of submissions to the op-ed page at Washington Post were from men, or that were coming over the transom just randomly or sporadically. And I want to know if it's an asset to identify yourself as a woman or as a person of color. And I want to also make that point very explicit that I'm asking both about women as well as about race and ethnicity, because I do feel a sense of discomfort that we have 5 white women on a panel about women as well, and that we have no women of color represented. So I would like to call out both things, but get a bit more of a sense of it's helpful to ask or to let people know.
Well, I guess it's easier on the women thing because other than Sydney, and one of my kids had once said to me, "Sydney, really? Can that be a boy's name?" It becomes more obvious, the gender issue. I don't know the answer to that question because whether it's helpful to just say straight out. I don't know. I know that it is certainly a great thing when there is diversity on the page in all its diverse elements, but I'm not certain that saying so explicitly is the best way is going to be the most effective way to get there. I'm not sure it would be held against you, but just can't say. And I pass on a lot of op-eds. But I've not been in the picking business, so I couldn't really tell you even if people do that.
We haven't been to this side of the room for a while. And the makeup of the panel, we wish we could have doubled the size and sought a diversity of backgrounds in terms of positions and roles, and certainly hope there'll be follow-ups with even more points of view. And also, that's why we're relying on the audience. Like a lot of the emails I sent out where we couldn't get everybody on the panel, so please come and speak up.
Jessica Hurd from Winneba Media. I just have a question. I'm not sure if you can all pitch in. The chances are that lots of the young journalists or wannabe journalists in this room might be freelancing or self-employed. And I'm just wondering, do you have any ideas, strategies for them, how they will encounter this issue, what they can do about it, and what their future might look like?
Anybody want to jump in on that, who's been in the freelance world? Or
I think that's a great question. I actually think that you're really touching on a bigger issue, which is that the whole way that people enter into this industry and start is changing radically. And I don't really know what that's going to mean for the future. I mean, the old traditional sort of career paths and ways that people started and where they got hired have gone through enormous change. I think that self-promotion is obviously enormously important and it's not really self-promotion, it is self-promotion, but it's not you're not promoting your face, you're promoting necessarily all the times, you're promoting what you can do, your skill set. If you freelance, you have to network. There's just no way you're gonna get work unless you network. And I think that networking is one of those skills that, I don't know, maybe, it's not something I learned in school. Networking is, I have no idea if they teach networking in journalism school today, but if they don't, they should, because that is one of the really key things. And it is something that women, everyone has to learn it. It's not easy for anyone. It is sometimes a particular struggle for women. That's what I would say. Anybody have anything else?
And we can continue this conversation afterwards. The reliable source will be open, and we can keep talking and, of course, keep tweeting. To one point that I had wanted to raise with y'all's obituaries for a fun shift in topic. Obituaries in major publications. Yes, no women die in New York. Thank you, Barbara.
Good to know.
Good to know. Can I move there? And again, yeah, this is
women dying in New York.
No. Women's Media Center and others have done some of this research because obituaries tend to be selected on who's notable, who's influential, and women don't seem to be registering. So I think this comes full circle, and I wanted to address it more in terms of earlier in life, the impact that you have teenage daughters, you have friends, you have young students out there. If we're not showing women as notable and influential, so that eventually they deserve obituaries, in the daily news report, what impact is that having on the careers and the aspirations of, across all the diversity of the consumers of what we all do?
I would just say, I don't know that there's like a lot of little girls that are reading the obit page, deciding where they're going to go in the future of their careers. But I mean, I think part of what you're seeing is a generational thing here, right? And so as there's more women that become in senior parts, as more women, are members of Congress or, cabinet secretaries, they're going to get covered more. Some of this is definitely on us, and the onus should be on us to find them. But part of it is also just a societal change where you have women, are doing more senior jobs than they were doing 50 years ago. And maybe that's a cop-out, but I'm just saying I think that you have to have some recognition of that.
Yes, but we're not just talking about women in prominent jobs. We're talking about women in all walks of life, as you mentioned earlier, Ken, if you're writing about poverty, if you're writing about immigration, how you get those voices in and why it's important in terms of the kind of world you want to mirror or reflect in journalism.
I think the most underappreciated and undervalued part of all of this is that in this regard, we need more, not just women as managers, but good managers. There are plenty of managers of every race and ethnicity who are bad. Plenty of them. There are not enough of them who know how to manage people, who know how to grow people, who know how to push people, who know how to be, and this is something you would think this would be the last thing that there would be a shortage of in journalism, honesty about performance. Okay? And that's where we fail as managers of an industry. I know this is the case in television, and I'm sure it's probably the case in print, whereas people do something wrong, not intentionally. Everybody talks about it except talking to the person who did it. So the onus is, and this is where the managing, because if that part of it isn't fixed, that's what sets the culture of every newsroom. And if that part is broken, if that feedback's not there, if that culture that makes you feel like you can go into your boss's office and say, why did this happen? I want a chance. I want to grow. Then I don't want to be dramatic about it and say all is lost, but that's the engine of any organization, is how it's managed and what culture it sets. And people have to feel like they can fail and still be okay. They can make a mistake, that that there's forgiveness. And people have to feel like they can raise their hand and say, I want to do something. But I think if that is where we need people the most, that is where, of every ethnicity, of every make, model, size, shape, anything, to be at the table. That's where the decisions get made. Forget, I tell people when I go to colleges, you want to be a reporter? Great. You really want to change the world? Be a manager. Those are the ones who are going to make the decisions about what stories are going to happen. I just cannot stress that enough. We need more managers. And the more women managers we have, the more the culture will change, the more understanding, the more men will understand. I've had to learn a lot in the past year. And that was because people were coming to me and say, blah, this is, you did this and this is not the best way to do that, or this is something you have to think about going forward. This is, when dealing with scheduling and things like that. It's really important. It's really important. The culture of an organization rests with who sits around that table.
And those are also, of course, the role models. I think we have time for each panelist to give a few final thoughts on how we ingrain this in good journalism. And we'll switch back down to Sally and go this way.
Well, I am actually intrigued by Matt's concept of trying to do this a little more systematically. I think that's an interesting idea. I don't know that that's right for every news organization, but I think that that's an interesting idea. And I'm also, what I mostly take away from this panel actually is I think I've spent most of my time the last 30 years worrying about the management and the promotion within the organization aspect of diversity, and probably have not spent enough time thinking about the people we quote part of it. I don't think I'm blind to it, but I haven't ever really thought about doing that in a systematic way. And that's an interesting concept. So for me, that's like a little takeaway I take away from tonight. I think that's an interesting idea for the future.
And your experience that you mentioned earlier in Iraq with women's sources.
Yes, look, it's a rough and tumble industry. I really think we have a responsibility to make sure that this industry pays attention to some of these issues. And the best way that can be done is there are systematic things that can be done, there are institutional things that have to be done. But I am a proponent of, stand up and take risk. That's what helps propel a lot of change, whether that's a talented constitutional law professor who puts herself out there more, or whether that's a reporter who says, well, I don't know, maybe I can have more impact in this institution if I speak up more and push some of the issues I care about. I do think there's a personal responsibility level to this too. So that's what I would say.
Matt?
I think we all agree that we're defined by our words, written and spoken, which is another way of saying it's always been about the story. It always will be about the story. And so the Women's Initiative that we've embraced actually starts with the story, or stories, I should say. The more stories we do that illuminate women in all activities brings us that much closer to recognizing among ourselves what is missing and what needs to be done. Because the thing that we admire most, the thing that defines us here as journalists, is the stories that we write. And so if increasingly the stories that we write and report and broadcast are about women doing extraordinary things, surprising things, because that's the definition of news, we have a much better chance of recognizing within what's missing and what needs to be done to improve it.
So two quick things. One is you asked about the notion of quotation quotas before. I don't think we need quotas, but I think that some of the things that Matt has talked about, and just this sort of, to use an old phrase, consciousness raising, it's something I have to say I never thought about really as a journalist when I was a reporter, what the gender balance of my sources that I quoted was. And I just think consciousness about that is a very positive thing in itself. And I guess because we all think that what we do is, of course, the most important thing, I think having women in positions of managerial authority in news organizations is really important. I also think that it's really important to have that diversity of viewpoints on op-ed pages as well. I don't only write about women's issues, but I also do write about I bring, like every columnist does, who I am to bear on the topics that I choose to write about. And there just needs to be more risk-taking and leaning in on the opinion side of journalism by women and others, because you're going to get called names, but you're also going to have your own shot at changing the world a little bit.
So when I covered presidential campaigns, my friends and I used to have a saying, which was the fish rots from the head down. And that means that every campaign was really a reflection of the candidate. They set the tone. The people who worked around them were trying to do what they wanted, and whether they were shutting out the press or letting the press in with lots of access was a reflection of what the candidate wanted. And I think that newsrooms are like that too. I think this only works if the leaders of our news organizations, like Matt and Sally, are communicating to the people who write the stories or get on TV and report stories and say it's important that you have a diversity of voices in your story, so that the people in the newsroom who are the reporters or the producers or the correspondents are thinking about that every time they go out there. And I totally agree with everyone taking personal responsibility for it, but I just think it's something that has to be communicated on a regular basis as a reminder to people that it's important.
Anna? I think you made a really good point, and that was about kind of taking that extra step when you're not on deadline. As somebody who is probably the one here who writes, every day, all the time, but really is kind of mapping out and having a strategy as part of kind of a professional goal is something that is really, really important. And the other thing as somebody who kind of mentors really, kind of junior women reporters, and just making sure to be available to help them, because I think it is a stressful job. It is tough. It's hard to navigate, how to manage up, and so kind of being a resource like that is really important.
At the core, I think, and I mentioned this before, being a good journalist is always the best place to start. But equally important is all that other intangible, nuanced part of whatever the culture is of where you work, and trying to understand that, which usually means being a little more assertive, which means being a good communicator, being able to speak up for yourself, being able to speak up in a newsroom meeting, and then ultimately, I think, having more people who want to be managers and manage newsrooms and be at the table where they make the decisions is ultimately what's going to change a culture in a newsroom.
Thank you all. And again, this is only one conversation on diversity. And I love this quote from the Global Media Monitoring Project. A nation or society that does not fully know itself cannot respond to its citizens' aspirations. Who and what appears in the news and how people and events are portrayed matters. Who is left out and what is not covered are equally important. And so on all aspects of diversity, I think there's a great sense of commitment here to having a better mirror of the world. I know I will go out and see whether we can get more men into Glamour magazine, and maybe older. Yes, okay, we've got you. Thank you. And I know the Reliable Source is open, and I hope we can continue this conversation on all formats, but really want to thank you all for taking this time. It's very generous. Matt just got back from South Korea the other day. He gets the Distance Award for coming here. So thank you all.